Hi, and welcome back to my shop. In my last episode, I completed cutting the bow front for the front apron of my live edge table. And I cut that out of maple, but the base of this entire table is going to be cherry. So my plan was to veneer the front of that bow in the apron with some cherry. The other consideration I have to make is that I want there to be the same cherry all the way around for all four aprons. So what I've decided to do is find a nice piece of cherry that I can cut into thinner strips of veneer, and then I can veneer even the back apron as well as the sides, and then I'll have consistent grain all the way around. So I'll show you how I'm going to do that. So for this veneering work, I've selected this piece of quarter sawn cherry. And I've selected this for two reasons. One, because it's quarter sawn, I get very straight grain, unlike the kind of swirly grain you might see in flat sawn cherry. And because it's quarter sawn, it also has some pretty interesting figure to it. So it's going to be straight and it won't detract too much from the walnut for the top, but it will have a little bit of character to it. Now I have a piece of veneer I cut from another board from this same batch. And if I hold it up, it'll give you a better idea sort of what this grain looks like. It's got some real kind of swirl to it. So it's almost figured in a lot of ways. So I figured that would make a good veneer for the aprons for this piece. Here you can see my resaw setup. Now I have the Carter magnetic fence set up here, and essentially that allows you to set your resaw fence at any angle you need. For any different blade you might put in your bandsaw, you might even get a different drift angle. All you have to do is draw a straight line down the middle of a piece of stock and then freehand run that through your bandsaw about halfway through, just splitting that line. And whatever angle that piece is when it gets halfway through, that's the drift angle of your saw. And you want to make sure that you set your fence to that exact same drift angle. Now in my case, I did do this test and my drift angle happens to be completely 90 degrees to the table. So I'm able to actually use my fence to back up the mag fence in my case. So I've got this set up about 3/32 of an inch off the blade, and that will give me enough material so that when I bring it over to the drum sander, I can then smooth it down to a 1/16 of an inch veneer. I'm starting out with a piece of stock that I've already jointed one side flat and then squared the bottom to it, so I know that my piece is going to be nice, flat, and straight before I start cutting the veneer. Notice I'm using a push pad as well as a feather board to make sure that the piece stays completely flat against my fence. That way I can ensure that I get a nice, consistent, even veneer. Then all I need to do is go flatten that side once again on my jointer, and then I can just repeat the process. I just need to reset my feather board, get everything lined up, and I'm good to cut my next piece of veneer. I've got all of my veneers cut now. This is way more veneer than I'm going to need for this project, but I figured since I had this board already pretty much designated to veneer and I had my saw and everything set up, I might as well cut them all. I did leave the last piece extra thick. It's probably about double thickness. It was just a little bit too thin for me to send through the bandsaw again. But it certainly won't hurt to have one piece of veneer a little extra thick. So I'll run this one through the drum sander first, get this one cleaned up, and then I'll lower the dimensions so that I can cut or finish off the thinner veneers. I'm now taking the thickest piece of veneer that I cut, and I'm going to use this for the curved front. And because this is going to be curved, I want to hit this one last time with some 220 grit sandpaper, because this is the last time I'll have a chance to sand this while it's flat. And it's a lot easier to sand something that's flat than something that's curved. And then once I get this nice and pretty much finish ready, then I'll glue it to the substrate. Now that I have my piece of veneer nice and sanded, I actually went a little bit overboard and sanded all the way up to 400 grit. You can even see the light kind of reflecting off of it. It's so burnished at this point. But what I'm going to do for my glue up is a series of layers and just a lot of clamps. So one thing I want to make sure of is that my veneer is overhanging the piece. Otherwise, I would actually leave a void in there. I'm also sort of sighting this down, finding the best part of this piece of veneer to use. I have a little bit of sapwood along this top edge there, so I'm going to just overhang the bottom a little bit. I've got a couple defects here that I'm going to leave kind of out of the picture. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a piece of bending ply first. Actually, I'm going to use wax paper as well in between this layer because I want to make sure I don't get any glue between those two. Then I have a piece of foam insulation, and then I also have some clamping cauls here, and these are basically cutoffs from the legs. I ran them through the bandsaw so that I know that they match the contour here pretty perfectly. And these are thick enough that I'll be able to use slightly fewer clamps than I would need to use otherwise, although this is still going to be a pretty heavy clamping exercise. And then that should give me enough pressure to get this thing to glue nice and flat without any voids. And this is exactly why they always say you can never have too many clamps. Well, the glue is drying for my front piece. Now I'm going to move along to the side aprons. And you'll notice I've milled some cherry here. And you might wonder, well, why are you using nice cherry and veneering over it when you could use something like poplar or, you know, maybe a garbage piece of maple? You're going to see soon why I'm using cherry here, but just bear with me for now. Now what I've done is I've cherry picked some of the best places out of those veneers that I cut. So I got a nice clear piece here for my one apron. That's actually going to go with this longer piece. Now this is just basically cutoffs that I happen to have saved, so I'm really not wasting any material here. I'm just taking advantage of some scrap cherry that I have lying around. And then because I have enough pieces of veneer here, I can be really, really choosy. So I'm trying to find, you know, a nice clear section of this piece of veneer where I can source this piece from. So I just kind of lay this down. I know that's where I'm going to grab it from. Got just a pencil mark, a little bit longer than the piece of wood that I'll be veneering it to. And then I'm just going to use a razor knife to actually cut this. If I tried to use a saw, this would probably shred. And it's thin enough that just a couple passes with a razor knife separates right off. All right, now I've got my veneers trimmed down so that they just overlap each of these pieces of wood just enough. And because all of my clamps are pretty much already in use, I'm going to use my manual vacuum press for this process. And all I'm going to do is I have two platens, and these are basically just pieces of MDF that I've cut little air grooves in kind of a hash pattern on one side of each. I've also made sure to round all of the corners over because I really don't want any sharp edges, so all of the edges have been eased. And then I'll just kind of create this sandwich. I'll put a piece of wax paper in between just to make sure no glue bleeds onto my platen. And then I'll just slide that sandwich into my vacuum press, and then I'll use that to adhere those veneers. After letting everything dry, I can remove my sandwich. Now I've got my veneer nice and securely laminated. And then lastly, I need to figure out a way that I could clamp the veneer to the back apron, and I just have a piece of maple here that I'm using for that back apron. I've already trimmed my veneer so that it's just oversized all the way around. And it occurred to me that my bench itself would serve as one really big clamping call. And then I also have this MDF I-beam that I created to help me construct my workbench, and it's been kicking around the shop since then. But it's also a very long, thick, rigid, straight piece of material that'll also serve as the clamping call for the top of this. So between the bench and this I-beam, clamp those two together, and that should give me a nice strong clamping force in order to keep this flat. So now I have all of my components rough cut to size. They're actually cut to final width. I ran them all through the table saw at the same setting. They're left oversized in terms of length because I have to now think about the joinery I'm going to use on each of these. But I now have my 4 aprons, one of them obviously being a curved apron, and I'm going to have very consistent grain all the way around because all of these veneers were cut from the exact same piece of cherry. So in the next episode, I can start thinking about how I'm going to join the aprons to the legs.